Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, deeper learning friends and family. We are so excited to bring to you this new deeper learning den style of video recording that came from you from the past, that's coming to the future to talk about education. Our session today entitled Sticks in a Bundle, Deeper Learning as a Radical Resistance idea. And so today I'm excited to have two of my dear colleagues, Tony Simmons, Ulka Joshi Hanson, here today to talk about their work. And we're going to be spending some time talking about deeper learning, talking about how we move forward, and really starting with how are we reckoning with the present. And so I'm going to just kick it first and foremost to Ulka to give you a little bit of an introduction, go forward, and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing and how you're doing.
Great, thanks, Laura, and welcome. Thank you to everyone for joining us. As Laura said, my name is Ulka Joshi Hanson. I'm Chief Program Officer at Grantmakers for Education. We are a member organization of education funders throughout the US. And in my role, I really work with our partners to think about their learning agenda. I'll back up and say, how am I doing? This moment's hard. It's hard personally. We are all exhausted, kind of depleted from reserves. I have just had a chance to start going back into schools, and it is really hard to watch leaders and educators really doing their best in a context where so many of them are feeling attacked, not supported, and seeing young people in front of them who are struggling as well. I have two sons, they're 13 and 15, and even inside of our lives, where we had a lot of privileges in terms of our home and stability, they are struggling. And so, honestly, sometimes the days are hard, and I have nights like last night where I just don't sleep because my brain is going all over. So, and having said that, there's this quote, I can't remember it exactly, but hope is not knowing that you will make a difference. It's sort of knowing that you will keep trying to make a difference, right? And I that's why I'm so glad to be here, because this group and Tony and Laura and others in our ecosystem, I do think we are operating in this moment of radical resistance. So really glad to be here with you all.
Thank you, Ulka. Tony, and I'll do my intros at the end. Tony.
Sure. Well, thank you. And it's an honor to be here with these two fine, professionally recognized, brilliant ladies, and in conversation about who we are as educators and where we're going and what kind of future we can imagine. So I'm Tony Simmons. I'm the executive director at High School for Recording Arts. I helped create it with my buddy David T.C. Ellis. Back in 1998, we received our charter. I also co-founded and co-lead the New School Creation Fellowship at High Tech High Graduate School of Education, and always looking forward to a chance to collaborate with various groups of like-minded educators around the country, wherever I can. So, how do I feel? Perhaps interestingly, rather energized. We just like everyone else have been going through a lot, and it has been very, very difficult. Matters around racial and social justice, in addition to the pandemic, has put tremendous pressure on all of us, particularly our community here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And we're dealing with matters really up to the minute. But at the same time, I get my strength and my energy from my community, from definitely my young people and our staff. We are explicitly an organization that has a social justice lens. So we know that our work includes the standing up and fighting for our young people who have been so marginalized and oppressed for far too long. So, you can only do this work, with energy and a sense of, purpose. But do I have tough days? Yes. Do I take care of my Do I do the wellness things?
Mhm.
Yes. Meditation, a massage here and there, good sleep, all of that matters. So thanks for asking, Laura.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, and again, I'll just share my name. So I jumped right in. I got so excited to introduce our colleagues. But again, I'm Laura McBain. I'm the co-managing director of the Stanford D.school and former High Tech High family member. I spent a long time designing the Deeper Learning Conference that all of you are now at and watching for about 5 to 6 years. And really excited to see this new version of the Den. As some of you who've been past participants might have known, that the Den was like a little small intimate room where we could have a conversation about ideas. And moving into this virtual environment, it's kind of the same thing. We are literally probably in our den. I'm in my den as we speak, recording this conversation. And our hope today is have a conversation about things that are on our mind, that are brewing. And one thing that I want to start with today a little bit is this question of reckoning. One thing that I love about each of you, and I've been in a lot of different settings, whether it was Grantmakers for Education with Ulka sitting next to her, writing plays, thinking about deeper learning. I've been with Tony many, many times, early days, long nights, talking about as deeper learning, as a social justice, as Ulka said, an opportunity for radical resistance. And I think one thing that I know about each of you is that you've been doing this work for a long time. None of this is new to you. And I'm curious, and maybe we'll just start with Ulka and we'll switch to Tony, is this moment for the last couple of years has been about this reckoning of K-12 education. And I know that both of you have been seeing the challenges way before the pandemic happened. And I'm curious, as educators that have been spending their life, their passion, their commitment in making a K-12 and deeper learning an act of radical resistance. What do you think this moment around this reckoning of education? What do you think this reckoning means for us? Where do we go? What have you seen that's been brought to light that maybe you saw before, but now everyone is seeing? So I'd love to talk about, maybe I'll just swing it to Elka. What does it mean for us to really think about education right now in this reckoning moment?
So I know, Tony and I both have a little bit more of an extended, offering that we do, but I'll answer it quickly and then hand it to Tony before we go into that. Things don't change, systems don't change, people don't change until we're forced to. And even at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember thinking, this feels like one of these moments where things are going to be disrupted so much, going to affect everybody in different ways, but affect everybody. And it's very rare we have things in this country that do that. And then when you layered over the kind of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement, and just the kind of length of this, it seemed to me that this was kind of an opening where so much of what we'd taken for granted and always said kind of held us in place was disrupted, not through anybody's fault, right? It was a global pandemic. And so I think it's a choice, but it feels like an opening to kind of wedge open conversations, opportunities for trying new things, pilots that move us long term in the direction of the system we all want to see, and not just in the way we've seen it, which is individual amazing schools like High School for Recording Arts, but rather the accompanying systems, right, that need to be rebuilt anyway. And so hopefully engaging a lot of stakeholders, funders, communities, parents, educators, in those conversations so that we can rebuild towards a different vision.
Well, building on that, one of the things I start with are the affirmations, the validations of the assumptions I and others made in the creation of High School for Recording Arts with regard to what our young people were missing in the traditional educational system and what they deserved in something that we were going to create with them. And, doing that work, mainly working with BIPOC youth, probably about 85% here at High School for Recording Arts throughout our existence have been African-American, practically all free and reduced lunch eligible, high homelessness, high, other basic needs not being met, but recognizing the brilliance and the genius of these young people first, and that giving them a dynamic learning environment with the goal of in helping them learn to be free was an assumption we had, and it wasn't really that well accepted in the beginning. People pushed back on it. They were used to controlling the bodies of literally the bodies of our young people, as well as suppressing their energy and just basically controlling them. So we had to fight through all of that, and we fought through that. Again, recognizing we had to have a social justice lens. It wasn't just that these societal factors were happening to our young people, in some other space. They were in our space. We are generally from the same communities as our young people. For the most part, we look like our young people. We value our diversity, but we do it in a way where, those in leadership really profess who that community is. So when something like a pandemic hits or issues around the murder of George Floyd, I think a lot of that initial work, those fights, the perception that we had and the perspective was just really, really key to us being prepared for this moment. And it manifests itself in so many various ways in terms of the strong relationships we built with our young people and their families, that when we went into lockdown, we had a saying, we're distanced but not disconnected. We were in the community, we were in even the homes with some of our student support staff, practicing social distancing, but still literally being there. The family seeing them at the curbside, delivering technology, checking in on them, doing all the things that are at the root of who we are as an organization, but then at the same time innovating and presenting to them continuous innovative learning spaces and practices where just because they weren't in the building, they had the whole world available and only left to them. It might even be just their little home space, but if we could get them a portable home recording kit where they could tell their stories, where they can chronicle what's going on in their community and do whatever, we know that that's a powerful, powerful tool of learning. So for us, it's opportunistic and it's affirming. Still hard. It's always going to remain hard, but I think that's a recognition one must accept in doing this work.
And Tony, I just want to underscore something, right? There was a funder that funded a project that NGLC and a number of other nonprofits were part of called What Made Them So Prepared. And one of the things they were doing was going around asking kind of communities, schools, educators, how were they faring during the pandemic? And the data showed overwhelmingly that schools like HSRA and the Met and educators and places that had really committed to the kinds of work that you are doing and the deeper learning kind of tenets did better. Not that it was easy, but that they had started with relationships, knowing their students, giving their students kind of a sense of ownership over their own learning, so that when they were on their own, they weren't completely rudderless. And so I think it was affirming not only for you, but I think around the country, we saw that those communities, learning communities or districts did do better, pivoted more easily.
And I would say that I think one of the things, and Ulka, I want to go to your new book in just a second, but one of the things that I was really struck by, Tony, and I think we saw, as Ulka's are saying, like this question of like what engagement really looks like. I think the pandemic gave us an opportunity to see like, oh, I thought this lesson was engaging. No, that was a compliant lesson. Kids showed up and now they're back at home and now cameras are off. FOBA is engaged. And it was like almost a real mirror about like what high school or middle school or young people actually think what engaging learning actually supposed to look, sound like, and feel like. And I think that was one thing that, again, as you said, Ulka, that like, I think schools that were already focused on what authentic engagement looks like for their communities were able to pivot, were able to be agile because they know how to, as Tony, you said, engage with the young people. You were already in the community, you were of the community, in homes, in families. So this question about what could be engaging right now, it changed, but you were already answering that question. You've been focused on that question the whole time. And I think schools that are focused on deeper learning, that's the question, right? It's around young people engaging in the learning process. It's going to help them thrive regardless of the conditions in that they're in. And I think that, to me, when I think about the pandemic and listening to folks, we did a whole project on TikTok at the beginning of the engagement of the pandemic, actually, trying to understand with Grantmakers for Education, ran 3 sessions about what were the kind of insights and learnings. And we were wondering, where do we actually listen to young people? Where are they telling their actual story? Not surprising, their stories were actually on social media. There are stories about how the pandemic was happening, yes, performative, were actually quite revealing about how they were watching Netflix while listening to their teachers, or how they were laying on their couch, or how they were chatting with their friends. And it gave me, as an educator, I'm like, no, they knew that they actually felt the same way when you were in school. Many of them, not all of them, right? But the pandemic really just showed, again, is the type of learning that providing, really helping our young people thrive, but also interesting to them, authentic to them, and really helping them want to learn beyond just sitting beyond a Zoom screen. I would love, Ulka, this really goes to the next question, that I'd love to ask you. You have this amazing new book coming out, or has come out recently, that's called The Future of Smart. Our education system needs to change to help all of our young people thrive. And I love this question, and I love the title of your book, because it kind of helps us reimagine, and I think one of the things that, Tony, you have done so much in your school is reimagine what it means to thrive, to be smart, whatever that means in a condition, and giving multiple possibilities. And so, Ulka, I'd love to switch it to you to kind of talk about your book and talk about what this really looks like right now as we move forward. As we move from the post-pandemic world, or whenever that comes, what does, a thriving education system really look like? So I'll just take it to you.
Thank you. And I will say, if anybody picks up the book, Tony's name is in the first few pages because he was generous enough to write one of the forwards for me. And the book, it was a long time coming. It's a synthesis of about 20 years of work that began. HSRA was one of the first schools I went to in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s. So what I'd like to do is just quickly give you a sense of the framework for the book, because I think it ties into this question of why deeper learning to me is an act of radical resistance, and why we need to see ourselves as part of this broader movement, right, to this sticks in a bundle idea of a lot of people in a lot of different places with different specific models who are all actually up to the same work. So I think to get to the future of smart, we need to go back a little bit. And so the first part of the book starts by trying to unpack some of the assumptions that we have all kind of learned about how and where and why our education system developed. We've all heard about the factory model. We've all, I think, generally agreed that we want to change it. And we think we've been making progress. In the book, I sort of argue that I'm not sure we've done as much as we think we can. So the book kind of takes us back about 500 years and kind of says, about 500 years ago in Europe, there was something very specific that happened that shifted the dominant worldview of that culture, right? That up until that point, most human societies and most human beings, while they didn't know all the scientific facts or didn't know the specifics, really understood themselves to be part of a bigger whole, connected to the earth, to nature, to each other, in very intimate ways. And they sort of experienced life and learning in embodied ways. You learned in your community, you learned what you needed to contribute and thrive, as a person and a member of your community. And around 500 years ago, there was this shift right around the scientific revolution, where the metaphor of a machine kind of emerged. And there was this idea of, if we could take the world apart and break it down to its smallest pieces and look at them and understand them, we would understand the whole. And so all of a sudden, people's worldview became sort of fragmented into different pieces. We took things out of context to try and understand how they worked. And we began to privilege a very conceptual notion of what knowledge was, of what learning was. And I'm just going to pause to say that what's very interesting to me about this kind of shift in worldviews is that it's actually mirrored in the structure of the human brain. So there's a gentleman named Ian McGilchrist, who's a psychiatrist in the UK, who's done kind of 30, 40 years of work on this. And this isn't the right left hemisphere stuff that we often hear, right? That the left hemisphere is about math and the right is about art. We need both hemispheres of our brain to do anything, and especially complex work, creativity, writing, reading, understanding. But what McGilchrist says is that the two hemispheres of the brain are different in how they pay attention to the world. So the right hemisphere is kind of this big funnel, right, that takes in our lives as embodied being. It takes in sensory data, kind of holistic data. It's all contextualized. It's embodied sensations. So it's like this big funnel that takes in flows of information. And then the left hemisphere is the part of our brain that actually helps us make sense of all of it and make it usable. So it takes all of this data and it processes it. It does decontextualize it. It creates abstractions, right, that allow us to actually make meaning and use of things. And then ideally in our brains, all of that goes back to the right hemisphere to be put in context. So some people might call that wisdom, right? And you kind of take what you've analyzed and broken down and put it back into the whole. And McGilchrist's argument is that over the last 500 years, we've had a shift in human society that we can see where we've become very left hemispheric to our detriment. Right. And this kind of overlays over these two worldviews, that the Cartesian Newtonian worldview, which is very left hemispheric in a sense, is juxtaposed against this holistic indigenous worldview, which is much more right hemispheric, this big picture. And different worldviews birth different systems. And part of why I wrote this book, and part of why I think it ended up taking so long to get it published and wasn't published 6 years ago, is because this is the moment when I think we need to understand that the conversations and debates that we're having in education and about the future of education are very related to the debates that we're seeing in lots of different parts of our society: economic systems, healthcare systems, criminal justice systems. Because a Cartesian Newtonian worldview is the same worldview that birthed slavery, birthed colonization, allowed for the genocide and the dehumanization of people. It is the same worldview that allowed us to view the natural world as a resource to be extracted. It birthed unrestrained capitalism. It birthed a hyper-individualistic sense of responsibility, right? And holistic indigenous systems birth different kinds of systems where we see ourselves as connected to the earth and ecology and conservation. Social capitalism, right? How does capitalism serve people? How are we more collective in the decisions that we make? How do we think about liberatory systems and intersectional systems? What I want to point out, though, here is that you'll notice that this is not a table. And it was a student design firm that helped me do the graphics for the book. And I used to have this information in a table, and I didn't like it because it made it feel like it was either or. And so this young woman said, well, untable the table. And so you'll notice here that the Cartesian Newtonian worldview is not wrong. The systems and the knowledge that we get out of it are not wrong. They allowed us to create a vaccination for a virus in a year. However, they are limited, and they need to be understood and contextualized inside this broader understanding of the world in order to serve us as human beings. And I think as we think today about conversations about racial justice, about the harm that is done by what I think of as a modern Western supremacy culture, it does harm all of us because in many ways it's taking us away from our humanity. And that affects all of us regardless of the color of our skin and our privilege. It obviously affects some communities more than others, but it kind of creates a slight subtlety in some of the conversations we're having about why we want different systems. And the same worldview that birthed all these other systems birthed conventional education, right? Where education was seen as the creation of economic and social units, We don't really consider human development at all. We think of learning as happening in very sequential and linear ways. It's very much about abstract knowledge. So you're smart if you can do the math on a paper, not if you can build something, right, in a wood shop. It measures what's easy to quantify and simplify. It's about standardized data, rigid requirements. Whereas a human-centered approach to education is much more liberatory in the sense that it is about the individual human being, the fullness of them, their spirit, their mind, their body, and it's about helping that individual to kind of grow into who they are. It really reflects human development. It's jagged and nonlinear when we understand education, right? So it's a very different kind of education system. And you notice that it's birthed out of a holistic Indigenous worldview. So the last thing I'll share is that part of my research over the last kind of 5 or 6 years has focused on, so what's the current landscape in the US, right? How do these kind of abstract ideas play out? And I won't go into the details of the research, but about 2.5 years, 70 plus schools and learning environments that range from your very no excuses schools to much more unschooling environments and everything in between. It turns out you've got these 3 educational orientations that are informed by how people think about the purpose of education, how they think about the developmental needs of kids in the age band that they're working with, their theories of learning, the pedagogies that they use, the ways that they think about discipline and community development, and how they think about assessment. And if we go deeper into this, you will recognize a lot of this as very consistent with deeper learning. But the conventional model is really our factory model, right? So it's all about college prep, very strong on core academics. You're doing social, emotional, and character work, but it's very limited. And it's very functional, right? We do socio-emotional work because it helps kids do better on tests. And character is, these are the habits of scholars. And if you don't do it, you're not responsible or you're not whatever. And so it's very paternalistic in that sense. This middle bucket is whole child innovative reform. It's the biggest bucket. And the way I talk about it is we recognize what didn't work here and we bolt on solutions, project-based learning, socio-emotional learning, culturally responsive practice, right? But we bolt it onto a fundamentally flawed system. And so what often ends up happening, this looks really different, but systems kind of buckle under their own weight because it's too much to do. And what's critical here is that these 2 are birthed out of this Cartesian Newtonian worldview. And so the argument that I would make is that we cannot get to racial justice. We cannot get to educational equity by sitting in this middle bucket. Right, that the way we have to get to racial justice is this human-centered liberatory approach, which is birthed out of this holistic Indigenous worldview and really centers this notion of relationship to community. It's doing deep social and emotional work that's built into the fabric of how adults and students engage with each other and their communities. It's deep character work, which is who do I want to be in the world and how am I supported in becoming that? And it's social justice oriented in the sense that young people are part of their communities. And so the world comes in for them to learn from, and they go out into the world to learn about the world, and they can't help but learn about the issues that are impacting their lives. And so that becomes part of their learning. And the academics are very much about interdisciplinary engagement. And so you're much more balanced in terms of core, non-core, and cognitive skill development. And, it's very developmentally aligned, happy to come back to this, but this kind of a system, right? Deeper learning, schools like HSRA that want to do this work. And if we're serious about racial justice, we need to build different kinds of systems that support the work of educators like you and programs like Tony's so that they are not constantly swimming upstream, trying to sort of protect themselves from a system that reflects this Newtonian Cartesian worldview and is never going to allow them to serve kids in the way that they want. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to sort of come back to any of these ideas, but the reason I think this is radical resistance is because this is the moment when I think all of us need to be pushing our communities, our funders, our stakeholders about what it is that we're building towards. Yes. And it can't be going back to where we were. It's got to be radically different.
I love that. And I first, let me, I know this is where this is our den is not surprising. We're riffing as we always do because we get excited about talking, but the brain piece, the image of that, I absolutely adore that image, partly because you've explained to me how my brain just works. Because I always use my analogy of my brain is like a galaxy, and I pull pieces from all these different pieces, and then I put them together, and then I put them back out there. My friends joke a lot with me that I'm like, I'm a good connector. I like, because, and the reason why I do that is because I see the connections across in between. And I think that in of itself, as a designer, as an educator, that's one of my superpowers. And I do think in a traditional system, perhaps that is not actually recognized, like the, whether that is. And I do think that ability, that smartness that you just described, right? We need to cultivate experiences where young people are able to make sense of the contextual information, the information that doesn't often connect with each other, in order for them to see the entire universe of what these ideas are. And that, I think, kicking it over to Tony, I mean, I actually think that's what you all do in your school, is you give students an opportunity to see the world, to shape it, right? And give them actual, like, authentic learning experiences that get them to take math, art, history, science, community, creation, and make these content areas that we think are separate, and build them into something that actually is like contextualized, authentic, and doable. And so I'm curious, Tony, if you can talk a little bit about kind of the work that HSRA does and some of the projects that I think really line up with exactly what Ulka's talking about, which is the future of smart.
Yeah, and just like you, Laura, as I was listening to Ulka and having read the book and contributed in my small way, it just reminds me of why we do the work that we do. And there's a million different experiences that we all brought to the table in terms of, the creation of HSRA, recognizing what was going on when young people were showing up at our recording studio before it was a school, passionate about learning, but had been pushed and kicked out of school. The schools didn't recognize their creativity and their genius. They didn't like the way they looked or showed up. And there was something that I saw, obviously David saw, and others, that something was missing. And we created that. So one thing, as Ulka was speaking, one thing I thought about was how important the hip hop culture was in contributing to our perspective. And, both David and I grew up, with the onset of hip hop. We were teenagers as it was coming up, and in a very, very real sense, what was going on in the Bronx with young people, taking back their creativity and their voices in the streets and the playgrounds, of the Bronx, was a clear rebuke of the traditional education system. At the time, all of humanity was being sucked out of the New York City public education system because of budget cuts and other things, and really, again, just not respecting who these young people were or where they came from or what their cultural currency and contributions were. So young people created something that was for themselves. And they just like young people, they built on it. Some parts were really, really healthy and contributing to culture. Some parts pushed the culture in provocative, really challenging, sometimes troublesome ways. In terms of misidentifying people in terms of their sexual orientation or different things like that. But at the same time, they were engaged in a process of learning. They were engaged in a process of empowerment. They were engaged in a process of collaboration. And for those of us who came up through hip hop, eventually that became our lives in terms of either as an artist or representing artists, we saw that could translate into what we were creating within our learning community. That the basic tenets of respecting those young people and their voice and their agency was what we're about. So we wrote, a new addition to Sam Seidel's book, Hip Hop Genius, that's just come out as well, Hip Hop Genius 2.0, really talking about that, really talking about, what does it mean for a young person to really tell their personal narrative in a way that is really compelling, in a way that brings about, other parts of our culture, other parts of core content areas. So like, for example, us at High School for Recording Arts, we've given our young people that agency and the voice and opportunity to create projects that are really meaningful to them around the push out, kick out crisis, where they created a campaign called 24 seconds. Every 24 seconds, a young person was kicked or pushed out of school in America. Young people really took that as a cause, and in a creative way, in an informative way, taught themselves and taught others about it and raised that awareness. So many other examples around environmental justice and climate change and healthy and unhealthy relationships. The key is that these are all strong, important areas of content that we want our young people to learn. When you think about what Chris Emdin has done with Science Genius and others around the country using hip hop culture, and again, I'm naming hip hop culture, but it's really just about youth culture at its core. It's about authentic youth who could come in irrespective of their race or their ethnic background, who understands their community, their families, their culture, their indigenous past, who are able to bring all of that into a learning space with them and have a community there that's supportive of that, accepting of that, and is willing to engage dynamically in that process of co-creation with them. That's what I believe it's all about.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that. And I've seen that witness. And I think one of the things, here at the D.school, and I know we're probably getting toward the end of our den talk, we could probably talk all day. But one of the areas that I think, when I think about our audience here that are listening, I think one of the questions that comes up, we need great exemplars like Tony, the stuff that's in your book, Ulka, how we create these systems. And, as someone who is, I now consider myself a human-centered designer, in these places, one of the questions that always rises up for me, and having worked a lot with the deeper learning audience, is how do we do this? How do we bring together our communities to co-construct what we like to call visions of coexistence? How do we, that in of itself, that question is, how do we create these liberatory systems? And, one of the areas that we're playing with at the D.school, and again, thinking about designers, is how do we bring communities along or create spaces for communities to envision what this looks like and sounds like and feels like within their community. All the pieces of the holistic education system that you described, part of ensuring that we create a liberatory structure in education is creating space for the co-design of that system in context with community, with young people. If we're going to design it, we need to design it together. And so I'm curious, and I'll share some work maybe at the end of the D.school, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that? How do we take, knowing that not everyone's probably in that worldview. Some of that old worldview or a traditional worldview has worked for some folks, right? It's probably made them who they are. They've made money and things like that. How do you all think about transitioning folks to this future of smart, to this holistic world where young people need to be in, so that they can not just be ready for some random future that's going to come at them, like the vocal world, as we say, but given the capacity to shape the world, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about agency. We're talking about the ability to shape the world. That's the type of high level agency we're talking about. And I think Tony's young people in the schools that you're talking about in your book do that, right? They're giving students the skills to not just be ready for a job that comes at them, but really thinking about the holistic, where the field is going and how they actually create an entirely new system or a new career or a new job or a new industry that didn't exist before. It's not just a job anymore. It's an entirely new industries that are evolving. And as someone who works with young, I want my young people to do that, right? I want them not just be ready for a coding job, but imagining the entirely new industry that hasn't even existed yet. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious how you all are thinking about that. How are you bringing communities together to kind of envision what this new holistic vision might look like?
I'd love to hear from you, Tony, because I know, right, HSRA is such a magnet for people to sort of come. And then I'm sure you get the same question, which is, what does it mean for us to do this in our own community?
Yep. So, as I think about that, I have to start with, does the future even include our young people? Just really on a very basic foundational level. It reminds me, there's a joke from Richard Pryor, the famous comedian. And as I was thinking about our conversation, I looked it back up again. I knew it generally, but he said, I saw Logan's Run, and Logan's Run was I think a 1970 sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
He said, it's set in the future. There ain't no Black people in it. White folks ain't planning for us to be here. As, you know, I mean, that's some sharp humor. And, you know, on one level, you know, it's funny. On another level, it's terrifying. And in a sense, it can be real. And we're seeing, you know, examples of the erasure of who we are as you know, an indigenous a culture of people from the African continent and, you know, other indigenous places around the world that hasn't been a part of that westernized, you know, process that Ulka just described to us, where, you know, it feels in some real ways that we're moving away from even being seen. So for me, you know, as a leader, I believe it's very important to make sure that we are being seen, and doing that in a way, one, where we're able to show people that our young people, not only do they just exist as caricatures, they're fully human, you know, they have lives and dreams. Sometimes it's as important as just reestablishing that they are kids, you know, they're not small grown-ups that oftentimes, you know, those from a different culture want to kind of put onto Black, brown, and indigenous young people, and that, you know, they deserve to explore and to be curious and to make mistakes and to learn from them. But then it's also important to show that they could perform at the highest level when they're given the space and the time and the opportunity to, that they could contribute to society like their culture has always contributed to society in multiple ways. And, you know, we always talk about a high school for recording artists, although we have incredible artists and incredible performers, we're not performers. We're not here to entertain. You know, we're here to show our young people how to develop their creative currency, because that is what they're going to need in the 21st century. Sure, some part of it is that, but ultimately it's about them having impact and being able to transform their communities. So, you know, all of those things are important. The demographics, being realistic, showing how, like in the Twin Cities, the communities of color is growing at an exponential rate. It's a reality. How are we going to deal with it? And I think, you know, once you do that, and then you begin to partner with stakeholders who help to plan and define the future, and you impose, you know, our vision into that, and you fight for it all the way every day to continue to be in that vision, I think that's just the best chance to do it. Unfortunately, you can't ever stop fighting. You know, that's just the natural position you have to take because of how strong those other forces are.
So Laura, I think we should extend by a few minutes and give you a chance to do the slides. But I have just a couple of like responses, right? And I think one of them you just hit on, Tony, which is, to my mind, you know, scale is this thing that we think about that's very left hemispheric. It's very factory. And this stuff is going to happen inside of communities. It's going to look different in different places. The impetus for it starting is going to be in different places. It's going to be about people coming together and sort of building the muscles to be together in this right hemispheric way, right? I think all of us have to work on sort of building them because our dominant culture doesn't teach it to us. I do think there's something, you know, Chris Emdin talks about neo-indigenous, this idea that many of us who come from backgrounds that are not necessarily native in the way that we think of indigenous Americans, we are neo-indigenous in the sense that these worldviews, these ways of being, are actually part of our culture. And there are a lot of European cultures, I think of the Irish, I think about, you know, Italians or whatever, where there are that. So I think the coalitions that we build around this are really important. I think part of the third bucket is the number of different types of programs, right? So I think Montessori, which tends to be associated with white middle class, you have alternative high schools that are part of that bucket. You have the communities and schools movement. So I think bringing all of us together to sort of demonstrate the types of outcomes and successes we've had. And the last thing I will say is human-centered models create what the world needs. So historically, what they have created has always been countercultural, when what you needed was widgets. With the way the world is going, with artificial intelligence, technology, all of that, all of a sudden, people who never would have been part of this conversation with us have an entry point into it, because employers are like, we need people with X skills. Parents are saying, oh, how do I prepare my child for an uncertain future? So I think there's a meeting of what these kind of human-centered liberatory systems create and what the world is demanding, which is again why I think there's this moment for us to have a different set of conversations.
I love that. And I think that's exactly right for Tony and because I know we've been spending a lot of time at the D.school exploring futures thinking, which is this radical idea of like what educators are futurists. And that's something that you just named is like, typically I would say futurism or futures thinking is dedicated to sci-fi, right? Just gives you, that's building a world, and as Tony pointed out, sometimes those worlds are actually not inclusive, but they're opportunities to build, new visions, like a new bold vision of what's possible. And so we've been playing a lot with like, what is, if educators are futurists, which means they are shaping the future every single day, which they are every day. How do we actually take some of the cool stuff that I would say futurists who typically have been white cis males, let's name it, in very like ivory tower institutions. And yet, how do we move from this, like what you're saying, which we like to call in futures, between foresight, which is like, what are the demographic shifts and let's design for that, to what we call strategic foresight. How can we actually imagine a bold new world? And if we can come together to do that, that's when we can actually bring in the multiple perspectives, the pluriverse, which is coined by Arturo Escobar and out of Brazil, which is how do we actually plate the multiplicity of possible futures? Because one thing that we've noticed is that like one thing that we've been studying again and looking at demographics as well is there's a recent study, I think last year, pre-pandemic, from the Longevity Institute at Stanford. Young people born today, they're saying is roughly going to live to about 100 years. That's the average lifespan. And depending on obviously race, demographics, pandemics, change that a little bit, but they will have roughly probably possibly 5 to 6 careers in their lifetime. And so that's wild to me. And so I think about, as you just said, what are the skills, dispositions, and the mindsets that our young people are going to need in order to thrive in this world that we don't know what the world's going to look like 100 years. We look back, we had no idea what could happen. And so part of, I think, this agency piece, and maybe I'll just show one slide that I think that we've been playing with at the D.school, and it's just a provocation that I think kind of points out to what we're talking about, which is like, we spent a lot of time posing this question. Educators must prepare to help our students thrive in a world that doesn't exist. I have seen that over and over again. And usually what happens is you get the World Economic Forum list. Like they need critical thinking, collaboration. And I'm advocating, of course you do. Collaboration, all that stuff is important. But like, there's a subtle shift here that we're thinking about, which is like, can we actually move from just preparing young people to thinking about how our young people are shaping? And what does that look like? That's a different set of mindsets, a different set of skills. And it leads us to ask this question, which is we've been playing with, which really points to the holistic view that you started with, Ulka, which is like, what does the world look like? And we have 3 questions that we've been asking and we're encouraging educators to ask. Is like, how will the world change and why? What might people need in those futures? And then how can we build for liberation? This is just a quick deck I put together, so it's probably a typo. But like this question of like, this question around what the world might change. And what you're seeing here is our teams, this is a couple of years ago, playing around with like, what was education? Like what were we doing and how does this change? And each one of these little icons, essentially, are design opportunities. They become opportunities to co-construct what we want to shape. And I'll just share one example, but like these little icons right here, I call these my underground volcanoes. So in an ocean, you have these like ground volcanoes that are like forming and shaping, they're moving, and they will eventually come to the surface. That is what happens. We know this, and then to tectonic shifts are shifting all the time. And so, what are they? What's coming at us that we actually haven't even begun to thought about? And so, not surprising, as you just mentioned, we saw, of course, like technology. And we're like, oh, snap. Like, not only is technology changing at a rapid rate, but it is biased. It is causing harm. It is non-inclusive. And right now it's being trained in much schools is like, I need to become a coder. I need to learn the code and I'm going to code this thing. And I need to build something. And I think as someone who's been a maker and someone who thinks about project-based learning, we spend a lot of time thinking about like, we got to make this thing. And I think we spend less time thinking about what are the implications of the thing I'm going to build. And so like and again, this goes to your holistic view, is like, I think we all need to be technologists, not because I'm becoming a coder. My colleague, Carissa Carter says like, it's not being a coder, it's knowing what the code can do as an example. So we all need to create. So like our team created this magazine called Rep, which is a student facing analog magazine to help young people and educators understand what emerging tech is, like blockchain, AI, synthetic bio, vascular tech. Not because we know that like everyone's going to do this job, right? But we all should be informed so that we can shape it, so we can ask the right questions, so that we can become part of the conversation in shaping the future. And so those are some of the things that we're thinking about, is how do we all take on this question and what does that look like to kind of shape the future together? And I would be remiss to say that, if you're watching this, two of our amazing organization colleagues to work with that we've been working with are called our friends Affirmations from the Future. And they do an amazing world building game with educators, with young people, about what it means to build a future that focuses on Black justice, that focuses on that. Let's build that future together. Let's prototype that. Because if we can't prototype and we can't imagine it, how are we going to make it happen? And then our other colleagues at Resistance Communications are talking about how do we write stories of resistance? Because I think our job as educators here is not only to do the work, right, but also show the work, share it out into the world, so that the more we get visions of what you described, Ulka, as this holistic new worldview, I think that's part of our responsibility in radical resistance, is not just to do it, but also share it. Our responsibility to the future is to actually start showcasing what we think this could look like. And my kind of closing, we've been working a lot with Roman Kizanark, who writes the book, The Good Ancestor. If you have not read it, I encourage you to do it. And I think what we're talking about here today about the future of smart reimagining, I think for me, the question I'm sitting with is like, what does it mean for me to be an educator ancestor? What is my responsibility? And I think, as Ulka and Tony, you said, like, this is a moment of inflection. And if we are focusing on the short-termism of getting just back to normal, that's one approach. But if we're focusing on being ancestors to education, that requires us to really look to the models that both of you are providing, right? That asks us to think boldly and really imagine what that future might be.
I love that. I love that image. That's such a great one. Kind of puts every day in a different context.
All right. So let's close it. I know we're
so much fun too.
I'd love to have some closing words. We have like 2 more minutes. Let's just say closing words from the two of you. I gave my closing words. I'll stop. Closing words from the two of you. What's one thing, that educators who are listening to this can think about doing next?
I think courage. We're talking about some pretty powerful forces and systemic forces, and power concedes nothing without a demand, never has, never will. To imagine that the future, as you're describing, Laura, that we all as educators, being futurists, are tasked to do. We just got to remember that that again, there's going to be points where we're going to have to really resist, and we're going to have to push, and we're going to have to sometimes even agitate, and we're going to have to go to our supporters and our allies for strength and to help us um, to sustain that. So I hope people aren't afraid by that. I hope people are energized by it and recognize that it's worth it. And of course we've gotten here so far despite a lot of intention to not have the kind of future that we know is the right type of future for our young people and what they deserve. So we've had those fights. We've been able to have some degree of success. We could build on that, and we could get energy from that.
Mhm. So yes to both of your final words, and to the courage and to the resistance, I would add it's the and of taking care of yourself. To sustain yourself, I think it's about finding your people, right? The other sticks in the bundle and your community, because I think we do have to do this in community. That's part of sustaining ourselves for the work and kind of modeling for the young people we work with, that is how you are human, and that's how you build a future that works for everyone.
All right. Well, we will close this out. For all the folks that are watching this back home in their dens, we encourage you to have these conversations amongst your communities, and bring this back and show this, but have a conversation. And really, as Ulka said, we need to be humans and we need to have courage. So thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in real life at some point in the next year.
Thanks. Bye.